And now, just quick introduction to Candid for those who may not know us. We are a nonprofit organization with a mission to get you the information to do good. We provide the most comprehensive data insights and insights on the social sector. And we were formed in 2019 when GuideStar and Foundation Center merged. Candid combined the GuideStar's tools on nonprofits and Foundation Center's tools on foundations with new resources to offer more comprehensive, real-time information about the social sector. Our history is steeped in transparency, data, and analysis, and paired with guidance on how to leverage our tools. One of our priority initiatives as it relates to collecting data is Demographics via Candid, whose core team has organized this webinar today. The vision of Demographics via Candid is to reduce the burden on nonprofits by providing a standardized and centralized place for sharing demographic data just one time on their Candid profile, where it can be accessed by many. As a grant-seeking organization ourselves, Candid estimates we are asked close to 100 times a year for demographic information, often in different formats and segmenting by different categories. We see Demographics via Candid as a viable solution to stop the duplication of efforts for all nonprofits so we can get back to the missions we signed up to serve. In addition to increasing efficiencies by enabling nonprofits to share demographic data just one time, through Demographics via Candid, we will be able to aggregate data to inform a full view of equity across the sector, provide benchmarks to identify gaps and track progress, and provide a way to find nonprofits reflective of the communities they serve. We publicly launched this initiative in February of this year and are heartened by a strong and dedicated group of sector leaders which see the value of this movement to create a more effective, efficient, and equitable sector. We are now ready to introduce our wonderful speakers for today. We are fortunate to have with us Kelly Brown, who is the founder and principal of Viewpoint Consulting. Kelly's work researching and advocating for the critical importance of demographic data has positioned her as a leader in the field. We also have with us Laia Griño, who leads Candid's data discovery and real-time data teams. She is passionate about increasing the sector's capacity to make data-informed decisions to drive meaningful change. And to get started, we'd like to introduce you to the why around collecting demographic data. And there's no better person to help answer this question than Kelly. So Kelly, I'm going to turn to you and see if you can share with us your experience and insight around the why of collecting demographic data.
Great. Thank you, Michelle and Candid and Laia and all the partners around the table who we've worked with for many, many years. As I say, I've known you before you were Candid. I really appreciate the opportunity to continue on this journey with Candid as you really strengthen the organization's capacity to build the social sector through a commitment to understanding who the social sector is serving. What I often say, the who of what we do, and it's really critical that we really sort of get grounded in the why. Is because oftentimes folks are being asked for data, they're requesting data, there are a lot of opportunities for people to sort of wallow and share in data, but demographics for the social sector is really, I think, an opportunity that can really be strengthened. As we know from other sectors in the private sector and government and research, every other sector considers demographic parameters, among them race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, a number of elements. Many of these parameters are really de rigueur when people are trying to understand who their markets are, who their voters are, who their constituents are, because they understand that these parameters matter with respect to how people engage the world. And many organizations, social sector organizations and projects also understand its importance to varying degrees, I would argue. But what we found from research that we have done in localized areas, for example, in California, is that many nonprofits are already engaging demographics robustly. In many cases, it's uneven, and in many cases, they are, as Michelle alluded to, and sometimes burdened. But most organizations really understand why it's so important to understand the who of what we do, whether it's understanding your underlying populations and how your interventions are impacting on different populations differently. The why is really critical to informing impact and informing understanding. On the next slide, it's also important because this kind of data can also reveal disparities and opportunities to address disparities and inequities. So it's not just about impact, it's also about understanding how resources and capital within societies are distributed either equitably or inequitably. This data is really important to getting at that information and raising questions and strategies that can try to redress and address those disparities. It's often a little bit why people sort of resist this data in many cases, but I think few people would argue that it's actually irrelevant, and without this data, that's essentially what you're saying. So demographics are important to everything folks do, and they really do speak to the aspects of difference. And on the next slide, the idea of engaging difference can sometimes be uncomfortable. Sometimes people think that asking questions around demographics, again, around certain parameters like race or gender, sexual orientation, can create difference or exacerbate difference. But that's really not the case. We understand from our lived experiences is that these differences are real and they matter, and engaging them constructively and proactively and respectfully is really what yields the best outcomes, not only in particular projects or arenas, but also as we strengthen our society. It does make it sometimes more difficult to lean into what differences can emerge and engage when you engage demographic questions and issues. But it's really having the data to understand these differences that can yield the optimal results for society. So today, we really are going to get into the journey that Candid took with respect to the taxonomy. And on the next slide, I often refer to it as the tyranny of the taxonomy, because as you know, a taxonomy is really just a system of classifications. It's not necessarily just a survey tool or the terms that you use, but it's really understanding how to group and how to sort and how to categorize. And when you're doing that with people and individuals along different parameters, it can be really complicated and dynamic to engage. As you can see from the census that has been with the first census was in 1790, you can see that the trajectory over time has been a trajectory of better understanding the dynamics and diversity of a changing population. And the census has been the tool by which the country tries to better understand who it is and what it means to be an American. And that's really critical. It is a constant dynamic process. So not only do the categories and the level of granularity with the categories change, even the terms and the nomenclature have evolved over time. And it's the evolution, the dynamism that you need to get right, not so much the term at any one point in time. And I think that is what sometimes we want to help loosen people's concern with. We can't start to ask these questions or engage issues around identity and demographics until we get the right terms, because you'll find that in some populations, at some levels, you're going to need different kinds of terms and different kinds of granularity. At the general population, you might not be able to go as deep or as refined as what some arenas may need. But what we worked with Candid to do was to try and manage that balance between the getting as much data as possible while respecting and being as inclusive and as respectful of the evolving dynamism and complexity of our society as possible. So in the next slide, I think just some of the issues that surface when people are grappling with demographics or issues around identity, particularly in the social sector, and particularly when organizations are being asked questions about their demographics from stakeholders who matter, for example, funders and what have you. A lot of times organizations will be concerned because these queries often come up in the context of diversity and inclusion, which is often a value statement. So people are wondering whether they're going to be judged or penalized given the nature of their demographic data. Many people, as I mentioned, often don't feel comfortable just engaging and talking about identity. How do we ask the questions in the correct way? People are often concerned with the mechanisms and the tools, are concerned about privacy and confidentiality. So they want to be able to do that protected and do that correctly. Sometimes people assume that we don't need to ask, we don't need the stages because we already know who we serve. But all of these elements are really concerns that folks raise with respect to this data, but all of them are really legitimate concerns, but are concerns that more strengthened engagement with demographics and identity can actually help answer some of these questions and actually strengthen people's capacity to be not only impactful, but inclusive, equitable, relevant, and sustainable over time. So these are the questions that over the many years are continue to come up and be engaged through this process. And as we move through Candid's journey to be a mechanism to better, to optimally support the social sector and understanding the demographics of the field, we can get into answering some of these questions in more detail.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate you sharing that important context for this discussion. And now to Laia, who will briefly share some of Candid's nearly 9-year history in demographic data collection, and we'll go over the most recent changes we've made to this demographic section of the profiles based on field level research we conducted last year. So I'll turn it over to you, Laia.
Thanks, Michelle. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. And I didn't want to assume that everyone joining today is already familiar with the Candid's approach to collecting demographic data. So I thought I'd start there today. So basically, all US nonprofits are eligible to share demographic data about their staff and board via their Candid profile. And we ask organizations to share information about their leader, board, senior staff, and how people at each level of the organization publicly identify by race and ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability status. We recognize, and this came up in the questions registrants posed when they registered for this webinar, that some people aren't comfortable sharing this demographic information for privacy, security, or other reasons. And so we intentionally do provide a decline to state option, and we don't force organizations to answer every question. So this is how the demographic data that we're collecting gets displayed on an organization's profile. In this case, this is Candid's own profile. And as you can see, data for the board staff and senior staff are presented in aggregate, while as you can see on the bottom right, the information for the leader is displayed at an individual level. So this is how the data on race and ethnicity and gender identity shows up. And this is what the data on sexual orientation and disability looks like. Oops, sorry. So a pattern that we saw early on, and that's continued to persist today, is that organizations are much more likely to share information about gender and race and ethnicity, and considerably less so for sexual orientation and disability. And we're also more likely to receive demographic data at the leader and board level than for senior staff and staff. And I think you can see that play out in Candid's own profile. If you're interested in learning more, I think my colleagues will or have already shared a link to a blog post where we examine patterns in what types of nonprofits are sharing information, as well as what information they're sharing about demographics. So as of June 5th, more than 56,000 US nonprofits had shared some sort of demographic information with us. That number, as you can see, has increased significantly over the last couple of years. And we estimate that at this point, about 1,000 new organizations are sharing demographic data each month. So how did we get here? Candid, or what was then GuideStar, began collecting demographic data in October 2014, I think it was. At that time, GuideStar had partnered with D5, which was a 5-year coalition to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in philanthropy to launch the demographic section of organization profiles. And this was the first demographic data collection of its kind in the sector, and was meant to replace a sort of disparate efforts and approaches to collecting this data that had existed with something that could serve the sector as a whole. So it was an attempt to establish a standard for collecting this data with the aim of enabling a shared understanding of where we are collectively. And Kelly could speak much more eloquently about the history of that effort, but that hopefully captured it accurately and brief. 5 years later, in 2019, Candid revised the demographics section in partnership with Change Philanthropy and Equity in the Center. And by this point, we had learned a lot. So some of the major changes that we made included giving organizations the ability to share demographic data at the leader and co-leader level specifically, since we knew there was a lot of interest in knowing more about who was leading organizations. We updated language to reflect the changes in the way that the sector was thinking about identity. We also took steps to make it easier for organizations to provide this data. So by making improvements to the interface that organizations use to enter this information and providing better guidance. And we also added validation to increase the accuracy of the information so that the numbers actually add up. In 2020, recognizing the exponential interest in demographic data within the sector, we made providing demographic information at the leader level a requirement for earning a gold seal of transparency. By last year, we knew it was time to again update the demographic section of our profiles. And so we turned to Kelly and her team to do research that would help inform what those changes should be. And she'll share more about that in a moment. But just to go through the timeline, we also last year decided to make the Go for the Gold promotion permanent. And this is something that gives small nonprofits with under $1 million in revenue 1 year free access to Foundation Directory Essential if they earn a gold seal of transparency. Finally, this year, as Michele shared, we launched demographics via Candid and also updated the response options to the race and ethnicity category. Before I walk through what those changes are, I'd like to turn it back to Kelly so she can share more about the research that informed these decisions.
So that was a really helpful kind of journey that Candid went on with respect to sort of embarking on how can Candid and then GuideStar as an entity sort of help facilitate, sound knowledge and information around this kind of data within the sector at large. Again, given the broad, immense level of complexity of the social sector organizations, not only in terms of size, in terms of issue area, as I showed earlier, these terms around demographics, the level of depth and complexity can really vary across lots of different factors. And so what I think Candid has been trying to do is to understand how can it learn as much as possible around building a system that allows for as much good, accurate sound data from a sector that is so diverse that can then be a good foundation for partners to build upon and expand upon and refine. And also, as you can see through the journey that Laia referred to, that this is by definition an iterative process. In other words, there's not going to be a point where you're like, okay, we've done enough research, we've got it right, it's done. We never have to change this. Part of what Candid is having to do is to understand what is the cadence of evolution, like what is the cadence around which they have to change their systems and update research and update terms and what have you, as people change, because it's not just terms that are changing. What is changing is actually people and their relationship to their identities. So I just wanted to emphasize that one of the ways that we approached this more recent engagement around efforts to inform the most recent version of the taxonomy was really to think about the different parameters, the different elements of the data gathering process that is going on from an entity like Candid, which is basically an interface that is getting data from a broad and diverse set of constellation of constellations of organizations and entities. So that's gathering the maximum amount of good data as possible from the general population, again, not from any one specific group, but from as many as people as possible. Do that through a mechanism that is really aggregate proxy reporting on individuals within establishments. So the interface is usually one individual interpreting what is being asked and then going to get information on individuals, putting it into the system, and then having it reflected in the aggregate. So I'll go through a little bit about what are the, some of the sort of less obvious but real complications with that process of getting data. And then, of course, the third leg is really where I think a lot of the energy is like, what are the terms? How are people really wanting to be seen? How are communities evolving in terms of the languages that they want to be known and want to be seen? What is the level of granularity that we need given changing demographics, getting increased populations where there's a lot of complexity? How are we really capturing that in a meaningful and feasible way? So when we approach the research to try and inform recommendations around how Candid should present these things, these are really the three sort of pillars or stools that were under consideration, because this is really the key elements to good sound data that people can build on. Understanding, again, with the caveat that there is not ever going to be an entity like one entity that is going to capture everything perfectly. So we were really trying to understand what is the optimal level given this complexity. So in the next slide, what we're sharing is on the next slide, there is a graphic of, something that's coming out of emergent research among, demographers and people who study populations around, and combined with survey data research, is sort of what happens when an entity sort of receives a query or request for data. This is adapted from research that's done in enterprises in general, but we really thought it was helpful for people to understand that when they're thinking about the tool and the interface that Candid is designing and presenting to the sector, there really are a number of steps that people, whoever encounters that interface has to go through to get the data in a way that they can then be input and shared optimally. And the terms and categories are one thing that's important in terms of being able to interpret them, but then also sort of understanding, okay, who has that data? Do I have the authority to share it? Do I have to get it from someone else? These are all the steps that have to happen, whether you're in a small organization of 5 to a large organization of 500. It's a different kind of query and interface than an individual asking a specific question, demographic question on themselves. And so at each step, there's the potential for a roadblock or a drop off. And so being attentive to this process really helps folks understand how can entity like Candid or organizations themselves work to minimize and smooth this process or this train. So this is how we approached doing the research. So we relied on, large scale contemporary research that is often sort of generated by government agencies around terminology, around data collection processes. We engaged a number of stakeholders within philanthropy and population focused stakeholders who work within different populations to understand sort of what are the current terms and meanings and needs for the level of granularity. And then we supplemented it with a better understanding of just how to get good data on this kind of thing to inform the recommendations that we made to Candid. So I don't know if there are other questions that Laia or Melissa, you want me to, or Michelle, you want me to talk about in terms of the research, but I'm happy to share or respond to questions when people surface them.
Thanks, Kelly. No, I think that's great. And just to share how Candid considered the recommendations from Kelly and her team, like 3 things were top of mind for us. So first, we wanted to keep this section as simple as possible to minimize the burden on nonprofits. So as Kelly said, we understand that there's a lot of appetite and a lot of demand for more granular information on identity and race and ethnicity specifically. But we've also learned that nonprofits have limited capacity to collect and report this data. And so we didn't want to make changes that were essentially at odds with one of the major objectives of Demographics via Candid, which is to reduce the amount of time nonprofits are spending collecting and sharing demographic data about their organizations. As Michele said, we alone at Candid have to report this data 100 times in probably close to 100 different ways. Second, we wanted to maximize participation. So we see the benefits to individual organizations from sharing this information. We've been really heartened by some of the anecdotes we've heard about how the act of collecting this information and sharing it via Candid has prompted organizations to have internal conversations about diversity within their teams. But we also know that to realize the full potential of this data to shape our understanding of where we are as a sector and prompt some needed changes, it has to be collected at scale. And so that's another reason why we were leaning towards simplicity and trying to use terms that were as widely understood as possible. And finally, we wanted to align with existing standards. So we know that many nonprofits are already sharing demographic data, often with government agencies. And so we've paid particularly close attention to how federal standards for collecting race and ethnicity data are evolving. And aligning with these standards accomplishes two things. So first, hopefully nonprofits won't have as much work to do to share data with us because what we're asking them to share matches what they're being asked to share elsewhere. So they don't have to do any new data collection or interpretation. And second, it makes Candid's data, demographic data, interoperable or easier to use in combination with other data sets. And that's where a lot of the power of this data is as well. So you could look at an organization's demographics and see how that compares to the demographics of the communities they serve, for example. So to dive into what actually changed, first, and the previous categories are here in the left column, the new categories on the right with the particular changes highlighted in gold. And so first, we removed Pacific Islander from the Asian category and introduced Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander as a new term. And this was in line with federal standards for collecting demographic data. And for the same reason, we added Alaska Native to the Native American, American Indian, Indigenous category. We also added Middle Eastern North African as a new category, which was a gap that we quickly identified after we rolled out the last set of updates to this section. And this is also an addition that the federal government is considering after, I think, decades of advocacy by this community to be recognized. Finally, we removed African from the Black African American category because we found it was causing some confusion. And we updated the label for different identity to prefer to identify with another race or ethnicity because that's a more respectful way of asking people to share their identity if the other categories don't speak to them. And as Kelly has pointed out, responses to this question are also really useful because it can give you insights into how the categories might need to evolve in the future. So of course, whenever you make changes to a data collection instrument, how the data should be interpreted will also change. And so just to highlight a few things in particular that users of our demographic data should keep in mind. First, as new categories, of course, like our numbers for Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Middle Eastern North African will be low. But as organizations begin to share demographic data using these new options, the numbers will increase. And here's just a quick snapshot of the data we collected for these two categories as of June 5th. And I chose to share the leader and board snapshot because as I shared, that's the level at which we're more likely to get demographic data. Second, in some cases, former respondents will be misclassified until they update their information. So what does that mean? When we implemented these changes, we didn't change or delete anyone's responses. So we didn't want to make assumptions about who belonged where. So if, for example, someone that had identified a specific islander had previously selected Asian American, or Pacific Islander, they'll still be classified under that category until they update their information. And we did reach out to organizations to notify them that these changes had been made and encourage them to update their data. Lastly, over time, we expect to see fluctuations in the distribution of responses across these categories. Again, for example, people who identify as Middle Eastern, North African may have previously selected white or other identity, which I think is the guidance, or has been the guidance to those groups. And similarly, people who identify as Native Hawaiian may have previously selected Asian American, Pacific Islander. So aggregate figures for those categories may go down now as a result. And keeping this in mind is important because we don't want people to conflate these data fluctuations with actual demographic changes in the demographics of nonprofit staff. So I know we're going to turn to Q&A in just a moment, but I just wanted to wrap up by saying that I hope going through this history and learning more about the research has given you a better sense for how Candid has approached the collection of this data and how we're endeavoring always to make it easier to share this information, to reflect where the sector is. And as Kelly said, we view this as an ongoing evolution, and we'll share a bit more about that towards the end as well. But Michele, I'll turn this over to you now.
Thank you, Laia. Thank you, Kelly. Really appreciate you all sharing that background and context. And thank you all who have been asking questions in the Q&A, and also to our team who've been answering questions as we go along. I'm looking through the questions right now, and I'll do my best to get to as many as we can. One of them that has come up in two different ways, or at least two different folks that I can see, is really talking about, in addition to demographic data for staff, does Candid have any plans to add demographic data for the people that an organization serves? And pointing out that this data is also often requested by funders, and a funder has also chimed in that they look for that information.
So we do currently give organizations the ability to share information on the populations they serve. So a little different than demographics in the sense that we're not asking for numbers or percentages of like different communities you're serving, but we do give people room to express like a wide variety of ways in which they're serving different populations, whether that be race and ethnicity, gender, disability, those statuses that you've seen here. We also have room to share things about health status, so people living with HIV/AIDS, for example, or socioeconomic status, so low-income people, just to give a variety of examples in the way that people can share information about populations served. And I think because we're not asking for numbers or percentages for communities being served, then we have room to broaden the options that people can share data on.
Thank you for that. Just going through the questions, I'll share one about, I'm just going through, so please bear with me, but there's one here about where does West African fit into the current taxonomy, and wondering if you can answer that one too.
Yeah, I think that that level of specificity is again sort of in part of the trade-off. And as you mentioned, I think, Laia, you pointed out that we took out the African because the perception of it was it made people confusing, but that doesn't mean that we can't capture an emerging sort of sub-Saharan African population that not only in certain geographical contexts, as someone mentioned, but just in general. But I think for the time being, that is still going to have to be in the preferred to, we have a different population, or people in our organization identify in a different way, and this is how they identify. And that's where, as Laia was sort of indicated, that opportunity, while it is a transition into how, at what point will we actually have to add more granular categories. And I think that was the trend, the trajectory of even Middle Eastern and North African was over time that other category kept growing, and what was surfacing in that other category was Middle Eastern and North African, and that how it emerged into its own category. So I think for now, to answer the question around where does West African come, or other African immigrant or populations, for the current sort of setup, it still has to be captured in that other category, but we would encourage people to include that, because that becomes part of the research and the advocacy for moving toward a more granular, larger scale taxonomy.
Thank you. Here's another one that I also can help answer. It's We Are a Funder, which is also pointing out that they're a nonprofit too, which, yes, we appreciate that. That also collects demographic data on our own staff board in addition to from our nonprofit partners. Are there examples of funders who are sharing their internal demographic collection journeys as well? And in terms of that, I will say that we definitely have funder partners who have included that information on the GuideStar profile. And we also know that some are making sure that they get that in before they even sign up for it, to being or even asking their nonprofit partners to provide that information. I will also note that if there are any funders out there that participate in changes diversity amongst philanthropic professionals, we have been working with them to make sure that our categories are aligned. And for the first time this last year, there was an option to click, please share this information with Candid. And so we did get some funders who provided that information directly to us that we uploaded on their behalf based on what they filled out for the DAP survey. So yes, there are funders who are out there collecting this for themselves. Another one that I thought is interesting, and one is, has Candid considered breaking out the all staff category to not include senior staff? Seeing the difference between these roles can be useful. I wonder if anyone wants to answer that one.
It's not something that has come up before. That's an interesting question. And as I said, like, we view this demographic section of the profile as a work in progress, and we'll continue to do research on how it should evolve and how we can make it easier to share data. So no, thank you for calling that out. It's certainly something to consider.
Great, thank you for answering that. This one I think could be for both of you all, and maybe even myself, but among organizations that are taking advantage of Candid tools to collect demographic data, what do you view as some of the most common drivers? And the reverse, for those not taking yet advantage of Candid tools for this data collection, what do you view as some of the most common barriers? So I would say drivers, and certainly would look to you all too. I mean, certainly we hear that it's being asked of them by funders. Like we said, we've been asked 100 times for this in a year. So we know that it's out there and people are asking for it. And so again, through our partners, we're really trying to make sure that we can standardize on one centralized tool and really get to this overarching principle that Candid takes to heart, which is data one time, that we should only be able to answer this information one time, that where it can be accessed by many. So I'll say that. And then for barriers, you know, Kelly, through all your research, I'm wondering if you can share what you've seen and maybe tee up some of the things we're about ready to talk about in a bit, about what's to come.
Right. Well, sure. Well, I think, the barriers were some of the ones that I outlined sort of initially, which was their sort of, conceptual philosophical barriers of just asking these questions and getting this data. It requires engaging identity, and people, have varying degrees of comfort level with doing that. And so, and what we've often heard from our, from the research too, is that, there's variations in how comfortable different constituencies or stakeholders within an organization or project feel with it. It's just like, yeah, I can get it from my youth project, youth coordinators or what have you. The staff, I know they're right here, but the board is like, why are you asking me this? And so there are different degrees to which different stakeholders feel comfortable engaging some of the questions. But I do want to reinforce, that there are sort of some, mechanical, technical barriers that come from just having to answer questions when you're an organization, answer any kind of question in many cases. And I think those are not trivial, and it relates to, I think, some of the questions that people were referring to, and I think you mentioned it, Laia, as well, in terms of people being able to choose. It's important to remember that what Candid is getting is not an individual choosing, it's someone presenting data on behalf of potentially a range of people. So even when you're thinking about categories like multiracial and multiracial, what is being presented through Candid, you can either pick a multiracial category and put 5 people there, or you can put 5 different multiracial options, and that in order to capture the people within your organization. And that becomes so burdensome, not only in terms of sharing data, but also in interpreting that is where you really have to you really have to make decisions about what's feasible and what is an entity like Candid going to be able to really capture. And so I always kind of say the 75-25% rule is like, if we can get 75% of the data as solid as possible, there's always going to be 25% that needs more refinement.
Thank you. Laia, do you have anything else to add?
I'll just add that I think sometimes the fact that we don't capture identity in as granular ways as some folks would like us to is viewed as an obstacle. But what I'd say there is that there's still an opportunity to align with the top level categories that Candid has presented, because at least then the nonprofit, even if you're asking them for more granular data within those categories, you can have that data, but when the nonprofit is sharing data, if they so choose with Candid, they can still roll up those numbers to share those on the Candid profile. So this doesn't have to be an either or proposition, I think, which is another important thing to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Here's a question. I'm going to combine a couple, but does Candid have a vision or plan for being the conduit for running demographic surveys directly to collect the data from staff, board, and leadership? Asking because they see this, the legal implications as a major barrier to collect this information. So just to respond to that question, then we can get to the legal piece of it. We don't have any plans of becoming the demographic data survey hub. What we do hope is to be able, through some more research, provide survey tools that can help an organization collect that information on their own. So it's not through a Word document or, whatever, but there's some sort of piece of it where we can help collect that information, but we would not be the collector ourselves. I'll say that. And then for legal compliance, I know, Kelly, you have some thoughts on the legal, what is meant by the legal side. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say on that piece of it, or either you two.
Right. Well, it is important to note, as we know, just within the past, 2 weeks, there's been a heightened awareness that, the legal context and environment in which identity in general is being engaged is in flux, is under sort of consideration from given the cases in front of the Supreme Court and how some people are interpreting what that means. But it is important for people to realize is that this demographic data from the vantage point of employers is required by the Equal Opportunity Commission, or employers with over 100 employees are required to collect and share this information. So collecting demographic data is not illegal. Really, what needs to be considered is how you use the data that you collect. It's against the law to use it at the federal level anyway, for some individuals to use it to discriminate against people, and particularly protected classes. So it's really the use of the data that has legal implications, not so much just the collecting of it, but the sharing of it. I think people have raised some concerns around sort of privacy and how do you protect privacy. And privacy is really with respect. It really is centers on consent. And so if people consent, so for example, when you think about all of the individual CEOs who share their data through Candid, they're not private, obviously. They're public because they're sharing it as individuals, but they have consented to that. And so there isn't really a mechanism that if you are clear on why you're asking for the data, what you're going to do with it, how you're going to keep it from being used in ways that people don't consent to, if people consent to letting you share it, use it and share it for that purpose, then the privacy issues are really kept at bay in that sense. Now you have to have procedures that allow you to do that, but a lot of it really centers on transparency around request and consent and securing consent. And this is really actually an important issue, is because we know from a lot of the research is that people, when they're sharing this data, there isn't always consent. And that is why that process of organizations getting consent from the individuals on which you request their consent to share this data, that is an important step. And so you may know that everybody you work with is Black, or your Latino serving organization, but it really is important to institute that muscle and those mechanisms to have a procedure to ask people who you are. This is what we're going to do with it. Is that okay with you? And then to share it in that context, and that can help mitigate I think some of the privacy concerns that people are raising.
I'll just add one very small point to that. It's also why when we ask the question, we specifically phrase it as how folks publicly identify. So might seem minor, but I think it's an important distinction.
And I will also say, and I know it was answered, via our friends behind the curtain, if you will, in terms of a question around the idea of privacy, but just the idea that if it is public information. And so if you're not comfortable with that, there is a decline to state option, and that does get, shared as, an option, but if one is not comfortable, this is not, a requirement, and everyone should have the agency to respond as they feel they can and should.
Right.
Can
I just say a couple of points in the chat around the Supreme Court just pending decision on affirmative action. That is actually being very closely watched. There are concerns around the implications for what it means for how nonprofits use it, because it is a case specifically focused on admissions. But that is when we say that part of the legal landscape is in flux, that people are watching that very closely. And also to just remind folks, someone also mentioned that there are not protections around sexual identity around the EEOC, and that's real. So that it is illegal to use this data to discriminate against people. So that is why that it's even more important why people get consent when they're asking these questions, that people as individuals always have the option to opt out if they don't want this information engaged.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I have a question here. Where is it? Thank you all. You guys are wonderful asking all these questions. Do you allow people to select more than one category? And would that eliminate the need for the multi-ethnic race response? Or is there a risk of double counting? So I'll turn that to you, Laia.
Yeah, right now people can only select one, and it's for that reason it would make the interpretation of this data extremely challenging. If people could select more than one option, we did consider when we got the recommendations from Kelly whether for folks who do identify as multiracial or multi-ethnic, whether they should then have the ability to specify the races and ethnicities with which they identify. But again, the concern there was the burden we'd be putting on the person filling out the profile to add what those identities were. And then on the other side, how people would be able to use and interpret that data. So it might be something that's useful for organizations to elect for their internal purposes, but I don't see that as something that we would be asking for on Candid profiles. And again, that's why I say that hopefully this data is helpful to you internally as an organization. And so if you're collecting it, you can add additional questions. Again, the important thing to keep in mind, I think, is the alignment with the categories. If one of your goals is to reduce the burden on nonprofits who might be sharing that data with us as well for broader use within the sector.
Thank you. I'm going to just have one more question before we start wrapping it up. And one that I am going to say, and then we'll also share different ways you can continue to ask us questions and we can get back to you. But first, there's a question here about that the recently added Middle Eastern North African category. And so this is an organization that already collects this information, but doesn't have that as a category. And how does that impact our profile status?
I could see this. You could potentially make a tweak to your survey, and Kelly, you might have more thoughts than I do here, but you could specify that if they identify as Middle Eastern or North African, like instead of identifying as white, if that's not the way they want to publicly identify, to use that, prefer to identify with another identity, and that could be counted there. So you would still be able to capture that population, and not maybe have like a mismatch between what you mean by one category and what Candid means. But Kelly, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
I don't have. I mean, I think for if it's internal where you want to expand your complexity, you can add the category and then redo your survey, and then you get different data, and then you can rejigger. But it seems like people would only update their profile now with the new option to add Middle Eastern. If someone in their community is now Middle Eastern, they would just update their numbers, right, to include that and have that be more reflective.
Thank you for that. Okay, I know we're running out of time, and thank you for the rich discussion here. And if you have additional questions, feel free to send them to us at partnerships@candid.org. And I apologize we didn't get to all of them, but we can certainly work to answer them afterwards. And now just a quick view on next steps and where we go from here. So a couple of things I'd like to share with you is if you are a funder or a nonprofit or others, please consider sharing your demographic data through your Candid profile. And also, if you've submitted the information for your organization before February, due to the recent changes, we encourage you to update it so that is current and up to date. Then if you are if you are a funder and or a membership association, we encourage you to become a Demographics via Candid partner and ask your nonprofit community to submit their demographic data via Candid. And we support you by providing toolkits on how to communicate what the ask is, and also support your nonprofit community with programming to help them get up to speed. I will also share that the other thing that we ask is for our partners is to use the information that is available in Candid. So not ask for it in any other way, but incorporate this into the systems that you already have and use the information that you are asking your community to put into Candid profile instead of asking for it again. And the ways that we get this information to you are 4 ways. So if you are a nonprofit organization or an organization that has submitted the information via Candid, you can have a shareable link that you can forward on to your funders and other nonprofit partners, et cetera, who is interested in that. We also provide a dashboard where you can also take your cohort of nonprofits and just see what that makeup is. And maybe my colleagues will be able to share that in the chat, or we can follow up with what that dashboard is. It's a public facing dashboard, which calls on the information we have in Candid to show those constellations. We also, for our partners, provide data sets that you can use to upload into the systems you already have. And we have just recently launched our free demographics API so that it can be imported into your own systems. And I know there was a question in the chat about what are the technology providers that we are working with. And here are the 6 that you see right here. Foundant, Flex, and on and on and on. And just noting that Foundant has already incorporated that into their system. So they are on track, and Flex is on their way, and the others are certainly coming soon, or at least have promised to do so within the year. So we just know that this is very important, especially for funders, that this information needs to be incorporated into the already existing systems you have, and we're trying to make that as easy as possible for you. And then I'm going to turn it over to Kelly just to let everyone know we are going to continue to do some more field research. We really want to make this an experience and, provide information we can. So Kelly, if you would like to spend a few minutes or seconds on what we have coming up.
Right. Just, I think what we have in store is we've learned so much from our partnership with Candid over the past couple of years, and from some work we've been doing with some cohorts of foundations, that we really want to try and expand that understanding to a national level in a more rigorous and weighted way. So really trying to engage the broad spectrum of nonprofits across issue area, budget size, geography, what have you, around issues around demographics, how they're collecting and if data, if they are, what are they doing with it, and to some degree how they're interfacing with Candid's profile. So really just trying to get a much better grounded sense of how the sector at large is grappling with these issues and responding to a lot of the questions that people have surfaced in the chat. So over the next couple of months, we'll be doing some surveys and focus groups and interviews to get a better handle on where the field is and where it's going.
And with that, I'll close. Thank you so much.